The American dream has always been that families would own a home. Like upwards of 80 to 90% of Americans say that's just part of the American dream, to own our own home. But interestingly enough, in recent years, especially recent months, the percentage of people who say that's part of the American dream is dropping. Right now, 57% say that owning a home is part of the American dream. Now, part of that is inflation, right? Prices are really high. Interest rates are up. Not as bad as they were in the 1980s, but interest rates are up. But what most people are finding is that the real burden for that is simply this. 25 years ago, a house payment was basically 1 week's salary. It was about 25% of your monthly income. Now, the national average is that your mortgage payment is about 44%. That's nearly 2 weeks, not 1 week, but nearly 2 weeks of your average income. And so that begins to get really rough, especially if you live in California, where it takes 85% of your paycheck to pay for the average house price. Now that doesn't leave a lot of room for groceries if you got that much of a mortgage. And by the way, that's why people are coming to Texas. So just don't Californize our Texas. That's all I ask, okay? Don't Californicate my Texas, all right? But we love Californians. Y'all come on. Just put on a cowboy hat and some boots, all right? Yeah. And you'll be all right. But here's the truth. You might not ever get your American dream house, but you can have a home that God honors. We're talking about family in this series of messages, and we've come kind of down to the last portion of this. And what we're going to talk about this morning is what God really designed our families to accomplish. You see, marriage is a foundation. It's incredibly important, just like a foundation is incredibly important for a house. But we're building something on this foundation. And that's what we're going to explore in Psalm 127 this morning. Now, Psalm 127 is something of an interesting passage. It is written by King Solomon in the Old Testament. There was King Saul, and then David, and then Solomon was David's son. He inherited the throne. And Solomon was a builder in a lot of ways. He built buildings, he built a palace, he built a temple, he built cities. He was really a builder. And so he was a guy who accomplished a great deal. But on the other hand, Solomon was a relational failure. His son that would follow him would actually split the kingdom and confuse us all, if you've ever studied the Old Testament. You can thank Solomon's son for that. He had terrible relationships. He had all these wives, like 700 wives. He had 300 concubines. Got 1,000 women in his life. I mean, he's called the wisest man that ever lived. And I'm looking at that going, I don't know about that. Okay? I mean, I got one wife. I don't want nothing. That's all I want. I don't need any more. I'm trying to manage that, okay? So, and I love my one wife, but I don't want another one, okay? But Solomon was this success at work and failure at home in a lot of ways. So I think under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, he's uniquely qualified to tell us something about what family is really all about. Look at Psalm 127 verse 1, and we're going to read through these 5 verses. Unless the Lord builds the house, they labor in vain who build it. Unless the Lord guards the city, the watchmen keep awake in vain. It is vain for you to rise up early and to retire late, to eat the bread of painful labors, for he gives to his beloved even in his sleep. Behold, children are a gift of the Lord. The fruit of the womb is a reward, like arrows in the hand of a warrior. So are the children of one's youth. How blessed is the man whose quiver is full of them. They will not be ashamed when they speak with their enemies in the gates. In this passage, there is a definite division. And that division is between that which is vain and that which is valuable. And so we're going to tackle this from a couple of angles on the side of that which is vain, and then we're going to look at the end at that which is valuable. First of all, he would tell us that on the vanity side of this, on the emptiness, on the worthless, purposeless side of this, we need to exercise a couple of disciplines in our life. One of those is this: reject fruitless pursuits. Reject fruitless pursuits. He says, unless the Lord builds a house, they labor in vain who build it. I told you Solomon was a builder, and there's no doubt about that. He built the temple, the first great, grand, beautiful temple to honor the Lord in Jerusalem. David had wanted to build that temple, but God told David, no, your son will build it. You can't do it. So Solomon, the first thing he does when he becomes king is he goes into an agreement with the king of Tyre, which was modern day Lebanon, and he says to him, look, you have these great forests. As a matter of fact, the flag of Lebanon used to have a cedar tree on it. It used to have that's what the flag of Lebanon was. They were known for their forest, for their trees. He said, I want you give me lumber, you give me the wood in order to build the roof of the temple. Now, much of the temple was stone, but it had to have a roof, and you can't have a stone. They couldn't engineer a stone roof, and so they used wood for that. So the first thing he does, he starts building the temple. He starts amassing all of the stuff to build the temple. It took him 7 years to build the temple. Then he built himself a house. He built himself a palace. He spent 13 and a half years building this palace. That might tell you a little bit about where his priorities lay. But Solomon was a builder, and yet he says to us, unless the Lord builds a house, they labor in vain who build it. Now that word vain is one of Solomon's favorite words in his vocabulary. How do I know that? Because Solomon didn't just write this psalm. Solomon wrote many of the Proverbs. That's the next book in the Bible. But Solomon wrote all of the next book, which is Ecclesiastes. And in that book, he uses this word, or a form of it, 26 times in a pretty short book of the Bible. What does the word mean in Hebrew? What does the word vanity mean? It means empty, purposeless. It means something that really brings about no result. It means effort without accomplishment. Anybody ever worked on something you feel like, I'm not making any progress? That's the sense, the feeling of the word vanity. When I was a kid, my grandparents took me on vacation to Panama City Beach, Florida. And I don't remember exactly where this was. This is through the eyes of like a 7, 8-year-old kid. But they had this big machine. My memory is that it was like on an 18-wheeler trailer. And this huge machine. And it had all these pulleys and pistons, and it had gears and belts that ran and turned different gears, and then those would turn cogs, and everything on this thing moved, and had this big sign on it. And the big sign said, this machine does absolutely nothing. It was a lot of activity. It was a lot of motion. It was a lot of movement, but it didn't actually produce anything. And I don't know about some of you, but sometimes in my life I'm going, that's the mirror. Like I'm really busy. I'm really working hard. I'm really in constant motion. I'm really trying to accomplish things. I spend a lot of time on sports. I spend a lot of time on recreation. I spend a lot of time on doing a lot of stuff. And I have to slow down sometimes and ask myself, what am I really accomplishing here? I think that's a question that in our generation, some of us who are parents especially need to slow down and ask the question. With all of our activity, what are we really accomplishing here? What are we really doing that's going to last? I wonder sometimes with our fixation on things that our culture says is important, if maybe we've lost our way in some ways. I mean, we're not trying to raise an Olympic athlete at our house. That's not the point. If she goes to the Olympics someday, she would tell you that'd be a miracle. I mean, that's not going to happen, right? You're really not trying to raise the next Major League Baseball player. I know you think you are. I know your kid's special. They all are. Are you really, what are we focused on? What are we trying to accomplish here? I think you need to stop and ask yourself that question every now and then. Now, if you think that's the ultimate goal of life, I could say you could pursue it, but I want you to remember something. Unless the Lord builds the house, they labor in vain. It's not going to accomplish anything unless the Lord builds a house. I saw this story the other day. It was back in February in Dana Point, California. Now, Dana Point, California is a beautiful place. I have driven through there. It was so expensive. We were on vacation. It was so expensive. I couldn't even stay in a hotel in Dana Point, California. I mean, it is absolutely, it's paradise. And a bunch of millionaires, movie stars, singers, they all have houses in Dana Point, California. And one of the things is there are these high cliffs, and people buy real estate right there, and so you can look out on the Pacific Ocean and see these beautiful sunsets. Well, there was a landslide. The landslide was right in the backyard of Dr. Louis Brueggemann, an 82-year-old radiologist. His home is valued at $16.8 million. But I want you to look at something. We got a photograph. That's his house in the white right there. It is perilously close to going off that cliff, right? Now, Dr. Brueggemann refuses to leave. No, I am not moving out of this house. This is my house. He spent 56 years developing this place. He's invested all his money, a lot of his money in this place. He is not leaving. The authorities in California have told him, we believe it is stable. Let me tell you something. There ain't nothing in California stable, right? One little shake, one little earthquake, and that thing's going into the Pacific Ocean. I want you to have that picture in your mind that so much of what we build and so much of what we accumulate and so much of what we try to amass, it's perilously perched on a cliff, and one thing could knock it down. One little thing. And so we have to ask ourselves a question. Is what I'm pursuing really the main thing? Now, what is the main thing? Well, I'll tell you what Solomon would have told you. And I believe Jesus would echo these words. He would tell you the main thing is what they call the Shema in the language of the Old Testament. It's Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. There is one God and one and only God. Verse 5, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. Now, some of you let's stop right there. Some of you are like, well, I've heard that before. Yes, you have. Because Jesus said this is the first and greatest commandment. So that's why I say Jesus would echo this, even though it's an Old Testament passage. But look at what he says next. These words which I am commanding you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your sons, by the way, and I'd add daughters, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise up. Discipleship is not a program. It is a process through the life of your child and parents. You are the primary discipler of your child. We are here to help you. Our preschool ministry, our children's ministry, our student ministry, we want to help you. But you are the greatest influence in the life of your child. And it's not about, if you have a family devotional, God bless you, I love you, I'm so thankful. Maybe you could tell me how to do it. I'm going to be really transparent and honest. We have tried this family devotional thing, and we fail utterly at it. But that's not what Solomon said to do. Or Moses actually in the Shema. What he said was, when you rise up, when you walk in the way, when you sit in your house, when you lie down, when you rise up. In other words, as you are going through life and your child has a question, you be ready to answer the question. As you face a decision and you agonize over it, maybe rather than being anxious over it, you say, you know what, as a family, we need to pray over this decision. And you teach your child to depend on the Lord in that moment. It's not in a formal discipleship program where you sit down and systematically study theology. It's in living life in front of your child. And for you, I want you to listen to me. This is the most important thing I may say all morning long. And for you to live a life of wholehearted devotion to Jesus. Let me tell you what the next generation needs. They need some parents that they look at and say, if there's one thing I know about my parents, it's that they are wholeheartedly devoted to Jesus. They need to know that you are wholeheartedly devoted to Jesus more than you are wholeheartedly devoted to them. They need to know that God, that your relationship with Jesus is the number one thing in your life. The greatest gift you could give to your spouse is wholehearted devotion to Jesus. The greatest gift you could give to your child is wholehearted devotion to Jesus. Reject fruitless pursuits, because that's going to bear fruit eternally. I want you to listen to me. Your children are the only earthly thing you can take to heaven with you. They're it. You're not taking anything else, but you can take them. Second, he says, avoid anxious pursuits. I'm going to go pretty fast through this because it's really, really linked to the first one. He says, it is vain for you to rise up early and to retire late, to eat the bread of painful labors, for he gives to his beloved even in his sleep. Here's what Solomon is saying in that passage. He says, some of you get up really early and you go to work, and you work really late. Now, listen to me. Listen to me. Work is good, and work brings glory to God. I don't want anybody to leave this room thinking, well, what Pastor Bob said is we shouldn't work hard. Yeah, you ought to work hard. But at some point, you got to accept the fact I have done all I can do, and getting up earlier and staying later is not going to produce anything that I'm trying to produce here. Because what I'm going to do is eat the bread of painful labors. And here's where I get anxiety in this. I want you to see this. He says, you get up early and you stay late and you eat the bread of painful labors, but he, God, gives to his beloved even when they sleep. God will be your provider. The great disruptor of families in our generation is anxiety. We as parents are so worried about what the family down the street has and what maybe we don't have. We are so worried about politics, and we watch 24-hour news cycles, and we get all wrought up in that. We are so filled with anxiety that we are teaching our children, you really can't trust the Lord. That's dangerous. Jesus said in Matthew 6, verse 27, and who of you by being worried can add a single hour to his life? Here's what we know. Anxiety and worry actually takes away from your life. It never adds anything to it. There are actually physical problems that you can develop and ultimately lead to your demise if you allow worry and anxiety to flood into your life. And so here's what Solomon's saying in these first couple of verses. He's saying to us, there are things that are just empty. They look like they're activity. They take a lot of effort. You look like you're accomplishing something, but are you really accomplishing what you set forth to do? And then he moves toward the value section. And that is simply this. Invest your life in what matters forever. Behold, children are a gift of the Lord. The fruit of the womb is a reward. Children are not a burden. They are a blessing. Now, before I go too deeply into this section, I really want to say something. I understand uniquely, and my wife understands uniquely, that for some people, Mother's Day is not a great celebration. They do. Because you want that blessing. You want that reward. And for whatever reason, God has not blessed you, at least at this point. If you've heard my story before, Marianne and I tell our story at Lunch with a Pastor. We struggled with infertility. And our daughter did not come along until 17 years of our marriage. And the first few years of that was okay because we were so poor. Like we didn't know if we were going to pay for a baby, okay? But look, after about year 5, it was like, okay, we'd like to have a child. So there was about 12 years there that it was, Mother's Day was bad. I'll just be honest with you. We're celebrating family and children and all that at church, and the pastor and his wife are suffering in silence, if you just want to know the truth. So I want you to know that if you are in that situation, God gave me a heart for that during that process. And if you'll send me an email, I will add you to a prayer list. And this is what I promise you. God's given me a ministry to do this. I have prayed for countless. I don't know how many couples I've prayed for. I will pray for you. I will pray for you every day until you tell me to stop or until you have a baby. One of the two. So I want you to know you're seen. But I also want to say this. And I want to say this to a younger generation, that you're looking at life and you're saying, I want to accumulate, I want to have fun, I want to spend my money on me. And there's a point where that just becomes selfish. There is even a group of people, they're growing in number in our society. They're called dinks, D-I-N-K-S. Double income, no kids. We can have the vacation home. We can have the great cars. We don't have to change diapers. I mean, we don't have to have any of the bad stuff, and we can have all the good stuff for ourselves. Let me call that what it is, selfish. And it will work in your 20s. And it ain't bad in your 30s. But in your 40s, you'll start to get lonely. You see, God says children are not a burden. Children are a blessing. They are a gift from the Lord. The fruit of the womb, not fruit of the loom, fruit of the womb, that's mama right there, is a reward. You see, children are a gift. They are a reward. But let me say this to you. They are a stewardship. None of us get children forever. We have children on loan from the Lord. He gives them to us, and we give them back to Him. We mentor, we shape, we mold, we provide. Children are a stewardship. That's what He says in verse 4. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior, so are the children of one's youth. How blessed is the man whose quiver is full of them. Solomon compares children to arrows. And I think this is really important for us as Christian parents especially. I want you to hear me. And for those of you who are younger, you're not married, you're like, this doesn't apply to me. I wish that you would grab onto just a couple of principles here, because I do think for your future, this is important. God gives us children, and He gives us children, and the metaphor is an arrow. Now let me define a couple of words in here. He says, you're blessed if your quiver is full of them. The quiver was a pouch on an archer's back that held the arrows. Like they would reach that back, pull the arrow out. So that's what the quiver is. But the arrow itself is what is so important in this passage. He says, like arrows in the hand of a warrior. Archers were really important in ancient battles, because a lot of ancient battles were fought hand to hand, like sword to sword, man on man, just right there on the battlefield, face to face. But archers were behind the lines. And so archers would take their arrows and they would aim them and shoot them over their troops and into the other troops. And if the other army didn't have archers, you could just wipe them out. And that happened many times in ancient battles. But there are a couple of things that I know about bows and arrows. I'm not a bow hunter, but there are a couple of things I know. One is this: arrows go where you aim them. Arrows go where you aim them. So parents, listen to me. Wherever we aim our children is where they are likely to go. Now, unlike an arrow, a child has something. It's called a will. They could change the direction. But in this picture, what Solomon's saying is that if we as parents will shape and mold, and we will mentor and disciple our children, and we'll aim them in the right direction with that discipleship. We'll aim them in the right direction with that mentoring. We'll aim them in the right direction with our love for them. Then they are likely to go in that direction. But here's what I also know. Once the archer releases and that arrow flies, you don't ever get it back. That's painful. If you're a parent, that's painful. Some of you go, wait a minute, I didn't have an arrow, I got a boomerang. They came back. You know? Okay. I can't fix that in the sermon, okay? Every metaphor has its limits. What I'm saying is this: you have one opportunity. You have one opportunity. It's so short. Man, it's short. There was a woman in the Old Testament. Her name was Hannah. Hannah struggled with infertility. She prayed and she prayed and she asked God to send her a child. One day, she went up to worship with her husband, Elkanah. By the way, he wasn't much help. He was pretty insensitive at times. Like, Hannah would be crying and praying because she didn't have a child, and Elkanah would say, "What's wrong with you? Am I not better to you than 10 sons? Like, look at me. You got me. Why do you need a kid?" I mean, that's how husbands react, right? Hannah would pray. She went up to worship, and she was so fervent in her prayers that her lips are moving, but nothing's coming out. She's praying in her heart. And the prophet accuses her of being drunk. And she says, "No, I'm not drunk. I just want a child so bad. And I've sought the Lord, and I've asked the Lord, I want a child so bad." And he says to her, "May it be done to you. May the Lord do to you as you have spoken." He prophesied over her. She goes home. She and Elkanah conceive a child. She's going to have a baby. And Hannah makes a decision. She says, "I am going to dedicate this child to the Lord. He is going to be dedicated to the Lord from the time that he leaves my house. From the time he's weaned," actually, is what she says. We think leave our house at 18. That's not what she said. She said when he's weaned. Now, that's not like modern, like little bitty baby. He was probably 4 or 5 years old. But when he's 4 or 5 years old, she takes this little boy that God has given her, answered her prayers, and she takes him to the prophet. And she says, "I am the one that you prophesied over. And when you told me that the Lord would grant my request, and yes, I conceived and had this child, I dedicated my child to the Lord, and I'm here to give him to you to serve the Lord for the rest of his life." He lives with the prophet, grows up with the prophet. Now, she'd come every year and visit him. She'd come every year and see him. That little boy grew up. And he grew up, and his name was Samuel. Samuel was one of the mightiest men of God in the entire Bible. God used him to anoint Saul as king over Israel, the first king. God also then used him to tell Saul, "You've sinned against the Lord, and the kingdom has been ripped away from you like a person rips a garment." And then he goes and he finds David, and God tells him, "Anoint him as king." And he mentors David, perhaps the greatest king. He spiritually mentors him. This woman who would be anonymous to us without knowing who her son is, prayed and sought God and raised this little boy. So here's a question for you as parents. What if the greatest thing you ever do is not something you do, but someone you raise. What if the greatest accomplishment of your life is not an accomplishment, but it's sending out your child as a missional arrow to change this world? Our responsibility is to send out our children like arrows, aiming them in the right direction, teaching them the truth about who God is, teaching them, discipling them to go and change the world wherever they are sent. What if the greatest thing you do isn't something you do, but someone you raise? Let's pray together. Father, on a day like today, I know that people come to church with a lot on their hearts. Lord, there's some of us who come to this room this morning and we're asking ourselves in all of our activity and all of our pursuits and all of this constant motion and going and spending and working, what are we accomplishing? Lord, teach us to slow down and see your answer to the question. Lord, maybe there are some things we need to eliminate from our lives. Maybe there's some things that we just need to say, you know what, that's not really important. But Lord, maybe for some of us, what we need afresh is wholehearted devotion to Jesus. I pray also in this moment for those in this room who are struggling, young couples who so desire to have a child. And Father, I don't have that spiritual authority of the prophet, but I would speak over them. Lord, grant them the desires of their heart. And Lord, for those of us who do have children, teach us to be archers. Teach us to aim them in the right direction, equip them for the battle, and send them out for your glory. In Jesus' name, amen.